Ready, guys? Good evening. I'm Gene Grant, host of New Mexico in Focus on New Mexico PBS. Thank you all for being here. We're excited to partner with the Criminal Law Division of the New Mexico State Bar on this 2017 Albuquerque Mayoral Forum. Joining us tonight are 6 of the 8 candidates. Ricardo Chavez did not reply to our invitation, and Bernalillo County Commissioner Wayne Johnson has a zoning meeting tonight on Santa Elena and couldn't make it, so Commissioner Johnson did stop by the studios. I interviewed him yesterday to answer the same questions that these candidates will answer tonight. Head to our website, newmexicoinfocus.org, at the end of the forum to watch his response if you'd like to. Tonight we will have a conversation to better inform voters on where these candidates stand on some of the toughest issues facing our city. My co-moderators tonight are Jeff Proctor and Martha Burke. Starting with Jeff. Jeff has been a journalist in New Mexico since 2002, writing and producing investigative and explanatory stories about the criminal justice system here in New Mexico. He is currently the criminal justice system reporter for the New Mexico In-Depth, a contributing editor at Santa Fe Reporter, and the justice correspondent for New Mexico in Focus. Martha Burke is a syndicated political writer and money editor for Ms. Magazine. She's the former chair of the National Council of Women's Organizations in Washington, D.C., and now serves as a consultant to state and local governments on public policy as it affects women. Now, let's start with an opening statement from our candidates. We drew numbers just a few minutes ago to decide the order. And if I have this right, Michelle will go first? Yes. And as all of you are making your opening statements, we ask you to keep this question in your mind. What is the mayor of Albuquerque's #1 job? Michelle Garcia-Holmes.
Hi, I'm Michelle Garcia-Holmes, and I'm running for mayor of Albuquerque because I care about the crime issues in Albuquerque. And I think that is the #1 job that the mayor will have to address. They will have to hit the ground running to address the auto theft issue. It's #1 in the nation. And our city's facing some really tough problems right now. A lot of them involve crime issues. And I'm sorry, Gene, how long do we have to speak?
My fault for not saying it.
Because I was just about to go on and on.
Your question won't take away from your time. You're at about 30 seconds in counting.
All right. Well, crime seems to be the #1 issue. And that has been the question that I've been asked about on the campaign trail. But I want to talk about my record and where I've been. I served 20 years with the Albuquerque Police Department and another 8 years with the New Mexico Attorney General's office, where I served as chief of staff. When I retired from the Albuquerque Police Department, I retired out of the Crimes Against Children unit, where I investigated a lot of tough crimes. And that's what prompted me to get into this race. You know, little Lily Garcia, Victoria Martin's case, were really just horrible cases that we had to face in our community. People don't want to talk about it. People don't want to face the issue that we had some horrific crimes. And I think we need to address all of our crime issues, and that's going to be the toughest job for the next mayor.
Appreciate that. Dan Lewis, 1 minute, opening statement.
I'm Dan Lewis. I love this city, and I believe it can succeed. I'm driven to help Albuquerque succeed. The city has given me so many great opportunities to start several businesses as an entrepreneur, to lead one of the fastest growing companies in Albuquerque. I've created private jobs in the city, well-paying private jobs. We need a mayor, the mayor's office, who's created private jobs in this city. I've had the wonderful opportunity to lead and pastor a church over 15 years. I've served on the city council, and I have had the opportunity to raise my family here. Both of my kids that go to the University of New Mexico. They're going to be here for a little while longer, and I want them to have the opportunity to go anywhere they want. I want them to have the opportunity to choose anywhere they want in this country, to be able to live and raise a family. But I want their best opportunities to be right here in Albuquerque. The fact is, our city is not defined by opportunity, it's defined by crime. We're defined by criminals. I believe we lose millions of dollars every day in potential investment because of the reputation of this city. But I believe it can change, and if it can change, we should rise to that challenge, and that's why I'm running for mayor.
Gus Pedrati, opening statements, 1 minute.
My name is Gus Pedrati, and I'm running for mayor of Albuquerque. I'm running because I see a different future for the city. I've experienced a different truth within this city. And for me, when I think about the #1 job a mayor has to be for the city, it's about making sure that it's steering for something that we haven't talked about yet. It's a position of cognitive effort and critical thinking, community insight and vision. And it can't adequately steer if it doesn't create engagement and access to all of its spheres and structures. For me, this was apparent in 2014 after the Boyd shooting. which spurred a new question for me about civic engagement from citizens. And I think that especially after this weekend with what happened in Charlottesville, we've seen that we've been deaf to the issues going on around us. And anybody that has been surprised cannot honestly say that they've been paying attention. Our city needs a new direction. Our city needs a direction of understanding, a direction of access and input, so that never again do we make mistakes that leave our communities marginalized, or do we continue to create structures that don't actually serve all of us together. It's through this idea of togetherness, through this intersectionality that is truly Albuquerque's strength, that we can steer ourselves from a future that you'll just have to stay for. Thank you for having me today, Gene.
Appreciate it. Tim Keller, opening statements, 1 minute.
Good evening. My name is Tim Keller, and I bring to the table a unique skill set. A lot of folks remember me as the state senator in the International District here in Albuquerque, and I learned there how to challenge the status quo up in Santa Fe, but also how to represent a diverse community with lots of challenges in Albuquerque. Also now, of course, I'm your state auditor, fighting fraud, waste, and abuse. And for me, I've learned a whole lot about how government works and how it doesn't work, and what we've really got to do to change things in Albuquerque. But I'm also a father and a husband, and I'm born and raised here in Albuquerque. We're raising our kids here. And I really feel our city is at a crossroads. We have some significant challenges. And I believe that if we address those challenges head on, we can be a safe, inclusive, and innovative city that actually works for all of us. But for me, this race isn't about necessarily the people running. It's about the vision going forward. And I think the first thing that we've got to do with respect to the priority for a mayor is we've got to own up to these challenges. For too long, city has been avoiding directly dealing with issues like police shortages, job situation. We've tried pilot project, we blame Santa Fe, we blame the courts. At the end of the day, I'm running for mayor because that is the mayor's job. It's the mayor's responsibility to deal with this. And I believe we should be the best Albuquerque we can be. It's not about trying to copy Portland or be Austin or be Denver. We have everything we need here. What's missing is leadership to make those tough decisions, to actually solve problems instead of just talk about them.
Appreciate that. Brian Colon, opening statements.
Thank you, Gene, and thank you to PBS and the criminal law section of the State Bar of New Mexico. It's an honor to be here, and thanks to our guest here in the audience. My name is Brian Colon, and I couldn't be more humbled than to be here before you running for mayor of our beautiful city of Albuquerque. I am proud to say that 20 years ago, my wife and I made a fantastic decision. Little did I know that the city where I went to elementary school would be the same city that I'd come back to 20 years ago to raise my family. My wonderful son, who's a very proud Albuquerque High Bulldog, and my wife and I have been here, and this city's been phenomenal to me. I've been in a position to be able to break the cycle of poverty, to be the first in my family to go to college and enjoy things that every family in Albuquerque should be able to enjoy. Unfortunately, we are focused on that which is right in front of us. And right now, crime is riddling our city. It is actually a state of lawlessness in Albuquerque, and we have got to make that our number one priority, to rebuild our police department, to allow people in their homes to feel safe again. So in the Colon administration, we've got 3 issues. We've got public safety, economic development, and by gosh, we're no longer going to give the mayor's office a hall pass when it comes to education. We're going to get in the middle of that sandbox, and we're going to say, yes, we have a stake in this game, and yes, the 11th floor can be involved to lift up our city after bringing it together and build a better Albuquerque.
Appreciate it. Susan Wheeler Dykesel, 1 minute.
Well said, all of you. That was terrific. My name is Susan Wheeler Dykesel. My husband and I moved here in 2006, and I never dreamed that I'd be sitting before a group like this, running for mayor of this city, but I am, and I'm deadly serious about it. Starting about 9 years ago, 8+ years ago, I began doing what I call citizen advocacy around the city. I started out with the redevelopment as a community person of a derelict grocery store near my house, and there's been no looking back since then. In that period of time, I have worked to bring together community groups. I've worked with elected officials. I've worked with consultants, private, public, and I have learned so much. The body of experience that I have accumulated, including policing, and by the way, I echo all of my fellow candidates, policing, crime, and public safety is absolutely the number one concern that we must all deal with immediately, because it underscores every other issue. It colors the possibility of economic development and enhancing our educational outcomes in our city and everything else. So that will be my first and primary issue, and I've been involved already. I bring that 9 years of experience to you, and ask you to elect me to be your next mayor.
Terrific. Our first question is going to come from Jeff Proctor. I will tell you, we're going to be a little tougher on the 1 minute thing, opening statements. You know, you can kind of say your thing. But we have a lot of questions we want to get to, so we're going to be a little tough on time. Jeff Proctor.
Very good. So the first question, Ms. Wheeler-Dykesel, will go to you, and then we'll swing back down to the end and head down to the line from there. We've all seen the terrible statistics. The biggest one, of course, that we've seen is that Albuquerque leads the nation in car thefts per capita. That, of course, only scratches the surface of the question about crime, something you all mentioned in your opening statement. What uniquely is the crime problem in Albuquerque that has brought us to the situation that we're in now?
Well, it's a combination of two things, Jeff. But of course, they relate very closely to one another. It's drug addiction, drug abuse, coupled with poverty. Poverty underscores everything in our city. So that makes us somewhat unique, but not particularly unique. And poverty isn't necessarily a factor in every drug addiction situation. So were we asking for solutions?
That'll be the next question.
Okay, well, is that it? Or
Sure.
should I continue?
Please continue describing
okay.
what you think the
Okay.
problem is.
Well, I'm describing that as I do know that data suggests that 92% of all of our police calls right now concern either crises related to drug issues, mental and behavioral health issues, and folks who have found themselves to be unhoused, all of a combination of those things. As a city, we're going to have to take a multifaceted approach. There certainly are no simple answers. One of the things that I want to suggest, though, are mobile units that are dispatched throughout the city, possibly up to 12, that are like RVs that are staffed by medical professionals and psychological professionals that can triage folks right on the street and then transfer them to the mental health, behavioral health, physical health campus that we don't have presently. I'm suggesting something like the Tucson, Arizona model.
Thank you. Ms. Garcia-Holmes?
You know, it's a lot of issues, and I've given this a lot of thought. Number one, I'm going to say there's a lack of officers. APD is suffering from a lack of police officers and manpower to investigate cases. They have investigated good cases over the years and submitted those cases to the district attorney's office. However, we're dealing with the perfect storm. We ended up with a case management order that made it difficult to prosecute cases. There are a lot of issues that occur when you can't prosecute cases. And then now there was a constitutional change that then affected how individuals were released from jail. So now we have this revolving door because felons are released on their own recognizance, and they're allowed to get out on the streets. And we've all seen, you know, the young man's face on TV where he smiles when he got ROR'd and got released with no bond. We're dealing with a tough system that needs changes, and it needs changes at the state level, it needs changes at the legislative level, and we need more manpower in the police department.
Thank you. Councilor Lewis?
The city is defined by crime because nobody goes to jail in the city. And they don't stay there very long. And reforms by the court and the decisions of the New Mexico Supreme Court, they overshot in the effort to reduce the jail population. When you let 2,000 people out of jail over a couple of years, crime is going to go up in the city of Albuquerque. And when you identify 300 or 400 repeat habitual offenders that are stealing most of the cars, breaking into most of the businesses and homes, we have to have a mayor who will call it what it is. And it's not passing the blame, it's simply saying we are going to have to make the kind of decisions that are going to lead to accountability. And the fact is, decisions that have been made have led to no accountability. When people are out in the streets very quickly after seeing a judge, and when there's no consequences. We do need a police department that is fully staffed, and so it's going to take leadership to be able to do that. It's going to take money to be able to do that. We're going to have to prioritize in our budgets public safety, and that means increasing officer pay. That means giving them a competitive wage. But we have to be making more arrests, and we need to do policing, community policing that's intelligent and smart. We know where crime is going to happen in most areas of the city. And so it takes a strong police department that's respected and trusted, that the people in the city trust. And it's going to take changes to the criminal court system, the justice system. We have to, and I'm interested in hearing, in talking to the criminal section of the Mexico Bar, because we need their insight, because this is a problem and a challenge that all of us are going to have to deal with.
Mr. Pedrati?
Uniquely, we misunderstood ourselves. And this goes all the way back to the Hyde shootings. When we chose to, instead of respond with more services for behavioral health issues in our community, we escalated our police force. We didn't look to serve our communities more, we looked to protect ourselves, only understanding ourselves as a very small population in our entire city. This moved on, this created a culture of aggression, and now we end up in a DOJ mandate, which in so many ways tells us ways to fix these issues that we're still obstinate to because we can't hold ourselves accountable. Of course, we have a police shortage, only after decisions were made that made people want to leave, after cultures that felt oppressive even within the police units. All of these things are social issues. They're ways that we've neglected very vulnerable and important communities in our city. And the fact that we aren't moving forward with real plans to try and engage all of that together, to understand ourselves within our own context and holistically approach these situations, means that crime might not change in our city unless we have real alternatives for how to address behavioral health issues, addiction, and situations of homelessness through services other than our police force, not asking them to be behavioral health professionals anymore, then we might not get there.
Thank you. Mr. Keller?
You know, I think actually there's been some great pieces raised on this. For me, the challenge is we are aware of this, and we continue to look at the big picture, and I think that's so important. It is about poverty, and it's about addiction, and it's about gangs, and it's about the challenges of resources in the courts and the DA, and it's about how our city gutted the auto theft department, the unit that actually went after this. And so these are all real things, but I think what we've got to do going forward is we've got to actually be specific about what a mayor can do. You know, I am more than willing to go fight for money at the legislature for our courts and for our DA. I am more than willing to go talk to judges and to the DA about what we can do about revolving door criminals. But at the end of the day, the mayor's got to know what the mayor can do on their own. And I think that's what is important right now. So for me, it's about holding even the purchasers of stolen cars accountable. And it's about actually getting treatment delivered now through building a treatment facility in our city.
Thank you. Mr. Klon?
Visibility, enforcement, and execution. These are the things that we need to think about. We've got crime in our community. Yes, it's driven by opioid addiction, driven by gang violence, driven by behavioral health, mental health issues, and yes, of course, the underlying overall issue is poverty in our community. But at the end of the day, if you want to talk to members of the criminal law section of the state bar, they'll tell you there's no more prosecution. They will tell you that there are no longer DWI arrests. I want to believe that part of that is because we have Uber and Lyft in our community. But at the end of the day, we have zero visibility and zero enforcement because we do not have proper staffing for our police department. So the number one concern has to be not just budgeting for the proper number of officers, which it surprises people to learn that we have a budget that represents staffing at 1,000 officers on our streets and in our community. But unfortunately, we're about 150 officers short because we've enjoyed what they call vacancy savings. What I say is we can't enjoy vacancy savings because it's costing a whole heck of a lot more on the back end with crime in our community.
I want to follow up. Some of you scratched a little bit at what you could possibly do to address the issue. And I know that you've all, or most of you, have released plans on your websites and had news conferences about how you will address the crime problem. My question is, what are the two things, and we'll start with you, Mr. Colon, what are the two things specifically that as the mayor, you can do to address the problem? Not what do the courts need to do, what do the judges need to do, what does the district attorney need to do? As the mayor, what are the top two things that you can do starting on your first day in office to address the problem?
Jeff, the first thing we've got to do is rebuild trust. The trust has been broken between the leadership in APD and the administration and rank and file officers, the women and men that patrol our streets of Albuquerque. Secondly, the trust has been broken between APD and the citizens of Albuquerque. We have got to make a commitment to true constitutional community policing. So for me, it's about sending signals and messages and rolling up my sleeve and saying, yes, we're going to have a new chief of police. Yes, that new chief of police, she or he will report directly to the mayor. We're going to roll up our sleeves and be engaged in this issue. No longer will Albuquerque residents turn on the TV to find a different public information officer every evening. They need to be hearing from our chief. They need to know that we're staffing our our substations in the community. Why? Because we've made a true commitment to community and constitutional policing. So one, we've got to restaff appropriately. We've got to have new leadership with that staffing. And two, we've got to get back into our neighborhoods. That's how you address issues of crime in our community.
Thank you. Ms. Wheeler-Dykesel?
I don't disagree with Brian at all. First thing we'll do is find a replacement for our police chief, doing a national search, but we certainly won't neglect to look at qualified talent locally. Then, starting with that, examine our command staff, complete the Department of Justice settlement agreement to a T and exceeding its expectations. But at the same time, we must also address the many issues relating to poverty, drug addiction, a lack of education and opportunity, and those are very, very complicated things. I too will roll up my sleeves, as I always have done, and get out there and lead from the front. And I completely believe that our chief and our mayor will show up to things that matter the most to the community. Their faces will appear on TV, and they'll have something to say about it.
Ms. Garcia-Holmes?
The follow-up, I guess. Two things. I agree with Brian on this. I think we need new management in the police department and new leadership. Definitely, that's something the mayor has control over. But the other thing we have to do with that is we've got to get the politics out of policing. You know, we tend to not understand where we're going with things, and there's a lot of politics involved in policing, and we have to allow the officers to do their job. They have to be able to get out there, they have to be able to investigate cases, they have to be able to make arrests, and basically do their job. And it all reflects back on the leadership and management of the police department. If you have good leadership, they're going to make good policy, and you're going to have good officers out on the streets doing their job, not violating that good policy that's written. The other thing is we need proper staffing in the police department. We do not have enough officers, bottom line.
Councilor Lewis, two things.
Well, our police need good leadership. Speaking of the police department, we have to have somebody they can trust. I'll have their backs. We'll ensure that they're well-led, well-paid, and well-trained. But it starts by ensuring that they're well-paid. We're losing officers to other agencies, and we stop that by ensuring that they have a competitive wage, and that means a pretty significant increase. I voted against 3 budgets 2 months ago, because they did not put a priority on public safety. On day one, I'll propose a $15 million in our budget that would go directly to the Albuquerque Police Department for wages, for salaries. And we'll be competitive. We won't have to worry about return to work before the state legislature. We will have officers returning to work if we pay them 90% of their para. We have an incredible para. We also have other agencies around the country that are rating their para. And officers that are leaving those other agencies, and we have an opportunity to be able to aggressively attract lateral, experienced police officers to this department. So it's making sure they're well-led, well-paid, well-trained, they have the right leadership, and ensure that we pay them well to keep them here. We'll get to 1,200 officers. It won't be a question of, how many do we need? It'll be how fast can we get those officers.
Mr. Pedrati?
Immediately from the mayor's office, things that we can do, obviously get a new police chief, clear house and the command staff, really change the culture in the department right away. Also, we can move forward with making sure that we're using all the tools in the toolbox to finish the DOJ mandate by getting an appointed special master. This will allow for better oversight and commitment to the actual full completion of that mandate. And it makes it so that now the city can focus on service side support and making sure that no police chief can be obstinate towards changes, that no mayor or city council can be obstinate towards changes. And it also ensures that that person doesn't necessarily have the same skin in the game as a new police chief or an interim police chief, protecting that morale in that whole community. Meanwhile, we double down on that service side support model. We figure out how to use existing healthcare models like Project Echo and renovate it, ideas from Albuquerque for Albuquerque, and renovate it for city side services to better address those underlying problems of crime. Saying we're going to get those 800 officers, the 400 and some odd on the ground beat officers into communities faster through community policing models. We're going to be aggressive towards that academy change, towards de-escalation, more being a paraprofessional and resource to communities too.
Mr. Keller?
I think a lot of these are good ideas. I think it's important, though, we got to understand everything that I'm hearing costs money. And I think the mayor's got to know actually how to pay for this. And that's what I'm going to do on day one, is do things that we can actually pay for right away. First, we need more officers on the streets, literally. Every officer in my department is going to take calls on the street, from the chief all the way on down. That automatically puts 100 more folks on the streets. The second thing is, yes, we need a new chief and so forth, but if we get the DOJ out of there, we can use the legal fees, the millions of dollars that we're spending on legal fees, to hire more cops. The vacancy savings is real. We've got to use that money to reach out to former officers that are in Rio Rancho and Las Lunas and all around us and say, come back and help your city. Because now there is a mayor in charge who will be fair when it comes to promotion, fair when it comes to discipline, and we're going to have a chief that believes in community policing. Those are the kinds of things that are actually going to build more police presence on the streets and restore trust.
Thank you.
Perfect timing. Another question, APD, for everybody. APD used to have one of the nation's best solve rates for homicides and for sex crimes. Those rates, unfortunately, have slid quite badly over the past few years. And Tim Keller, starting with you, which crimes will you prioritize as mayor and how?
You know, I think this is a good example where we have been using historically this prioritization data-driven model as a substitute for real community policing based on beats and neighborhood communication. And so to me, it's actually about restoring the fundamental basics of police work. And that's step one. And then we've got to restore special units that deal with these issues around violent crime. And especially the top 100 revolving door folks. If they get let back out, then APD should send them back in. That's what the mayor should be doing. And we should be tracking those folks even on their way out. But for me to do that, you've got to actually start with separating those two activities. And right now, we're trying to double dip. We're saying you've got to police your beat, but you've also got to be on a special unit. And that moves around the city based on a newspaper article. We've got to get away from this kind of triage, whack-a-mole policing and get back to the basics.
Brian Colon, same question.
So look, we're not asking people to do double duty. We've just decimated the special units. We no longer have the special units we once had for violent crime, for property crime, for automobile thefts. We have got to rebuild those units again. It's got to be a priority. It's what makes the difference on the ground. Criminals in Albuquerque have no fear. It's because there's no staff to push back on crime. I am a huge believer in District Attorney Torres's vertical prosecution. And I do think that the mayor's office has a role in supporting that prosecution. We will assign people from the City of Albuquerque Legal Department to ensure that the judges are educated about the issues that are related to the people that are before them, to make sure that we hold them accountable and that everybody is accountable in the system, to make sure that folks aren't slipping through the cracks right out the back door to do what they've always done. And at the end of the day, if we're not collaborating more, if we're not closing the gap between these different units in Albuquerque, we're not doing our job. So for me, it's about rebuilding those special units so that we can actually prioritize all crime. So for me, it's public safety is number one.
Ms. Dykesel?
Public safety is number one, and rebuilding special units is absolutely mandatory, as is community policing models, blending those together in a way that will work seamlessly for our community. And once again, the revolving door. That's very, very troubling, that people are coming in and leaving, and all the cops know who they are. They know who these perpetrators are. They walk in, they're arrested, it takes hours and hours to process them, then they go through the system, and then they're back out doing it again. We must absolutely tie up those loose ends.
Same question, if you would, Michelle.
Well, what I'm told by the district attorney's office is that the same 600 individuals are arrested every 6 months. You know, we need to start analyzing exactly who's being arrested every 6 months. If it's the same 300 every 3 months or whatever. I mean, there's numbers there, there's data there. And data doesn't lie. We need to look at the data, analyze the data, and see it methodically how we're going to attack each of these crimes. Violent crime is important in this city. We have children being murdered on our streets, shot and killed on our streets. We must attack all forms of crime. And we have to build up our police department, no doubt, because we need officers to investigate those crimes. But at the same time, we have to understand we're going to be shipping off these cases to the district attorney's office office, which is understaffed, has a lack of lawyers to prosecute cases. So maybe what we need to do is sit down and say, okay, how do we fast track these certain types of cases, like property crimes cases? I think the utilization of ankle bracelets is a good start for some of these criminals, but some of them are too violent to be able to be let back out on the streets. So I'm going to take a data-driven approach so that we can crunch the numbers and see exactly where we need to attack crime.
Okay, appreciate it. Dan Lewis, same question.
1,200 police officers, uniformed police officers, and over 60% of those police officers must be in field services. And then when it comes to investigations, we have to have detectives that are actually investigating crimes. They're on the street and they're gathering evidence, and they show up in court. I will ensure that every detective in our department is actually on the street working and investigating crimes. And if they're not, then we'll get rid of that position. And so there's restructuring that needs to take place. We need to boost those detectives that are investigating. And there are special units. They're called detectives, and they're investigating sex crimes, crimes against children, auto thefts. We just need to make sure that our detectives have what they need, and that they're actually investigating crimes, and that they show up in court. Judges want those detectives in court with that evidence, and we'll make sure that they're in court.
Mr. Pedrati, same question.
To clarify, you're asking what crime we would prioritize,
Yes,
correct?
exactly right.
Thank you. First of all, I want to say that we would stop criminalizing addiction, homelessness, and behavioral health issues in our community and persecuting those populations. Then we would prioritize, and I want to specifically address this really very much concise type of crime so that we don't blanket word the use of prioritize in this conversation and say human trafficking. If you stand up for your undocumented communities, if you stand up for acts of violent crime, if you stand up for crimes against pretty much crimes against children too, then you have to focus at human trafficking. As we talk about cooperating with Bernalillo County Sheriff's Office more and more, that's a unit we can lean on. Their ghost department is doing terrific work. That's immediately a place for us to cooperate, protect some of the most marginalized communities, and also help systemic outbreaks that occur off of that, such as the violence that comes out of that whole arena. If you want a specific crime to go after that's really about you protecting and serving your whole community, even those that you might seem as unlike as yourselves or those that are traditionally marginalized, that has to be the choice here. And we have to go after it steadfast, working with the county and using all of our resources.
Perfect. Martha Burke, your first question.
Yes, my first question again is to Mr. Pedrati. We've been talking a lot about crime, but we know it has been proven there is a big correlation with crime, behavioral health services availability or not, and substance abuse. The facilities we have now, they have long waits, they're understaffed, there are delays, people cannot, in other words, get the treatment they need. It all comes down to money usually. How would you increase the funds for these kind of services to, in turn, affect the crime problem? And would you consider a tax increase?
Of course. First of all, there are a lot of places that sourcing funding for these issues, behavioral health, homelessness, addiction, could come from. Could be from community services, from public safety if we understand it as such. And there are also models that already exist that show us this is the correct way to do it. It's not a centralized model that becomes very crowded, that then makes other parts of the neighborhood undesirable or it's hard to transport people to. It's a decentralized model that allows for better access to general and ongoing care, that diminishes the strain on hospitals, diminishes the strain on jails, and provides better outcomes for our communities and also better employment opportunities through the whole umbrella of healthcare services. We can do this through grant programs, we can talk to the state about it, or we can just man up and say we're going to take this as a tax because we understand that if it's a responsible tax that we are very clear on, that it is sunsetted based on needs, then that is something that our community is going to vote for. We do it time and time again. We see needs and we fill it through funding that we need to create those programs. But I honestly also believe that with 29% of our budget already going towards public safety, with a massive department focused on community and family services, and with so many nonprofits cooperating in the city, we can better organize to show that the money is already there, our priorities are just off.
Thank you, Mr. Keller.
You know, this is something that we all talk about, and I think the plan should be to actually have a plan. So, look, we have the money. This is part of this myth of scarcity that we've had in our city for decades. And when we can afford building $28 million softball fields way out on the west side, we can afford building a behavioral treatment center. That is a choice, that's a budgetary choice that this city has made. And those are the kind of choices I'm going to do differently. We're going to use those dollars to invest in core services that will get at these root cause issues. Behavioral health, alternative to incarceration, diversion program in and out of jail. These are the kinds of things the city can build, and then partnering with the county, because they already taxed us, they can operate those facilities. And I think it's a pretty straightforward deal. We'll build it, county will run it, and we're going to put our money where our mouth is. And we're going to wait a year on a softball field.
Just a quick follow-up, does that mean you would not consider a tax increase? And secondly, where would you put the facility you would build?
I do believe we need as many diffuse facilities around the city as we can, but we also need a central facility. And so I look at the old jail, for example, as one possibility. And in terms of taxes, I think the first thing is the city's got to step up using the money that's available. But at the end of the day, if that's not enough, I always think we should look at all options, including taxes.
Thank you. Brian Colon.
Dr. Burke, I think this is really a big question, and I think our budget has to reflect our values. And if public safety is our number one priority, then our budget has to reflect that. We've got to make sure that we identify every bit of cost savings to focus our resources. And again, whether that comes to brick and mortar or whether it comes to programmatic issues and opportunities like increasing the funding for PB&J here in our community, which we've done through the Behavioral Health Initiative. Thank goodness for the county and their vision and the fact that many of us got out there and walked the streets and got signatures and got that ballot initiative passed. We now have that behavioral health tax. Now what we have to do with that tax is actually deploy it. And we're just starting to do that. So hopefully we'll be able to realize some of those benefits. And visiting with Dr. Paul Hopkins, he assures me that that's right around the corner. I also think that once we get those resources deployed, if we cannot identify a path with the resources that we currently have, then I'm always interested in putting a tax before the voters. It would be approved by the voters, but it's certainly something I'm willing to consider.
Thank you. Ms. Deischel.
I agree with everything I've heard. These are terrific ideas. And I also believe that we should have a central campus, nonetheless, for behavioral health and addiction care. I believe that addiction care specialists should be paid as professionals. And I also believe that the citizens of the city of Albuquerque, when they are given reasonable taxation proposals, vote to support them when it makes sense. But the city is lined up perfectly to have a tremendous cost savings by taking these kinds of different approaches to dealing with behavioral health, mental health, and addiction issues. And I believe that we'd probably end up coming through as a wash.
A quick follow-up to that. Again, you mentioned a centralized facility.
Yes.
The Albuquerque Journal said very recently, perhaps today, that much of the crime, the folks who are getting arrested are giving an address as one particular homeless shelter. Yes. Would you put a facility in a place where these people would not need a lot of transportation to take advantage of it? How would you get people into it?
I haven't really thought about that, Martha. That's a very interesting question. I'd like to see a facility, a lovely, desirable facility in Journal Center. That to be the central facility. I'd like to see transportation, like I mentioned earlier, that's mobile, where something akin to RVs goes out that are staffed with behavioral health professionals, medical professionals to evaluate and triage folks as they pick them up, and then to take them to a perfectly wonderful but non-residential part of the city to do all of those things. Probably better to locate it a little farther away from that particular address you're referring to.
Thank you very much. Michelle Garcia Holmes.
Well, we already had a tax increase to address these issues. The gross receipts tax increase by the county was passed a while back to address these issues. And what I would like to do is collaborate with the county to build a treatment center. If we build one or if we utilize MDC, I mean, I think we need to start the conversation and get it going and start fast tracking this, because this is a dire need in our community. We have a huge addiction problem in our community, and we're dealing with drugs, opioids and methamphetamine that we've never dealt with addiction issues before because they're so highly addictive. I would like to see a treatment center that would triage individuals and figure out what their short-term needs are. I think we're good at taking care of short-term needs, but these individuals have longer-term needs. And another thing that I would like to see happen is us work more diligently with our court system. We have drug court now, and it works quite well. However, I would like to see a LEADS program, a law enforcement assisted diversion in our police department, where if they meet up with an individual who has a drug addiction problem, maybe committed a minor offense in the community, but could have a choice to be taken to a treatment center and start on the road to recovery, I think we could implement a program like that pretty quick in the police department to try and take care of our addiction needs in the community.
Thank you. Final answer, Dan Lewis.
We have an epidemic of heroin and heroin and opioid abuse in the country. Albuquerque is said to be ground zero. I don't think it's reached its peak yet. So some solutions. I sponsored and put a significant amount of money into ensuring that there's naloxone, the antidote, to a heroin overdose in city buildings as well as in every police car and emergency response vehicle. It's been proven to not only be the antidote, help save lives, but also get people on a pathway to recovery. We do have $45 million in behavioral health that the city spends in the budget every year. $20 million a year, tax increase by the county. We could bond against that and actually build a treatment center without having to take it away from an incredible facility for teenagers and youth in this facility to do youth sports that keep them away from drugs. And also, with enough police officers, we should implement a middle school program where our officers have the time and the ability to be able to go into our middle schools and be able to mentor them, and then even a track in high school to get them on the pathway to be PSAs in our department, get them started on a career in law enforcement. But we have to, we're going to have to deal with that head on, and we do need consequences. I believe that a part of the solution is the consequences that help people and give judges even the opportunity to be able to, for those that want help, to be able to get help. And not everybody needs to go to jail. Some people need to be sentenced to help in treatment centers, and we can do that.
Thank you.
Jeff Proctor, next set of questions.
Dan Lewis, this question will start with you. I want to swing the focus around to a phrase that I think has lost some meaning in the conversation around policing in the city, and that is the phrase of police culture. I'd like to hear from you specifically what you think the culture is within the Albuquerque Police Department, whether you think it needs to change, and if so, what you can do as the mayor to change it.
I've been a critic of police leadership, our brass. I don't believe they set the example. They haven't been the kind of leadership that our rank and file has trusted. But we change them around by getting them leadership that they can trust, people that they will follow, the strong leaders that they're going to follow. And we have their back. We have to have the back of our officers. But we also got to pay them better. To be honest, we have pretty good incoming pay, $28 base pay. It's not bad. It's pretty competitive. But it's not competitive at 5 years. It's not competitive at the sergeant and lieutenant level. And so we have people that are going, we have a drain of officers that are going to Denver and Phoenix and other agencies. And so we have to pay them better. And it's going to take money, and it's going to take a priority in our budgets to prioritize police officers. If we do that, we will not have a problem with officers leaving. We'll attract laterals. We won't have a problem with return to work and have to go to the legislature and beg them to change the law. When you pay people 90% of their para, they will delay their para and they'll come back to work for 3 years. Good cops that'll come back to work and they'll mentor other cops.
So just to clarify, the police culture issue you see as a lack of faith and leadership, and the way you would address that is by changing the leadership?
Well, we have a leadership that has a bunker mentality, and they're defensive. And every opportunity that they had to be able to get ahead of the problem, they have not. And they've been defensive about it. And that's not leadership. We need people that are going to lead. Of course, we have to complete the DOJ. We'll get that completed as soon as possible, get the DOJ out of Albuquerque, and ensure that, those officers, they got to be well-trained and well-led and well-paid. And that's the answer to making sure that the morale turns around in that department.
Mr. Pedrati, police culture.
I don't think any of us need to use our own words here. It's in the DOJ mandate. It's a culture of aggression. This is why we're here. It's for excessive force in cases of behavioral health issues explicitly. How do you turn that around? Of course it's a leadership issue. That's why we're all here saying those same 4 things. We're going to hire a new police chief. We're going to return to community policing. We're going to correctly staff our police department. These are all similar concepts, and I'm so sorry I said 4 things and I just gave you 3. I'm just already ahead on this question. I'm sure I'll get to plug it in a second. Anyway, ways we can do it is we can actually promote de-escalation-based training. That's so important. That's about service side first. When we return to community policing, we're also reducing that adversarial mentality that's been built up, right? So it comes from leadership, yes, but it also says we're going to finish the DOJ mandate according to also the training and the demilitarization and de-escalation that it requires of us. This is something that's necessary and something we should all be talking about, because community policing isn't necessarily armed. Community policing isn't showing up as the emergency response unit every single day of the week. It's showing up as a role model. It's showing up as a resource. It's showing up as somebody who's ready to change their community for the better through interaction, not necessarily immediate need. And for me, when we talk about that police culture, there's such a bright future for it. But right now, is explicitly, and going back to the 2005 Hyde issue, we've created the wrong culture that's led to a culture of aggression through misunderstanding our needs as a whole community.
Tim Keller, same question.
You know, I do think those words describe a lot of the culture. I think if we unpack that a little bit, it's about several things, including this notion of sort of officer protection first. And that's a little bit different than this notion of guardianship or protect and serve. And I think behind the training and in the academy and all those policies and procedures, that's the fundamental cultural difference that we've got to fix. But in reality, that means all the things that we've been talking about. And I do believe the top is absolutely driving this. The favoritism as well is a huge issue. So when you look at discipline and promotion and the unevenness with which it's done and the lack of consistency, even the lack of input from the community, those are the challenges that drive this kind of culture further and further. And that head in the sand mentality prevents it from changing. So for me, we do have to get back to that fundamental notion of guardianship and of protect and serve. But community policing is more than a term. I've seen it in the International District. You have to be able to call your officer. You have to know them, and they have to know you. And they have to respect you, regardless of where you're from, your documentation status. You have to get that back, or that culture will never change.
Brian Colon.
You know, I think I appreciate some of the things that were said, but what I would add is that the current situation with APD officers is a state of exasperation, because they believe that politics drives every decision in APD, as opposed to best practices. So we've got to get back to best practices of constitutional community policing, as opposed to politically driven decisions. And that's only going to happen when we have new leadership. We have to reestablish the trust. When the trust is broken between rank and file officers and between the leadership of the city of Albuquerque, you end up with issues where you have officers inappropriately behaving in the field, because they are not focused on the training that they're being put through, because they have no faith in the system. They are exasperated. They're exasperated with being asked to have too big of a job with too few resources. So it's about getting the department back into balance with solid leadership that is going to be delivering an opportunity for them to provide that constitutional community policing, being back in the neighborhoods, reestablishing those relationships so that we can protect our community and they can serve.
To follow up, how do you get the politics out of the police department when the police chief reports to the mayor, who's a politician?
That's an excellent question, Jeff. And I think at the end of the day, you have to have transparency. You have to have a police oversight committee that not just is respected by one side of the community or another side of the community. You've got to give them the capacity to make sure that everybody has a faith in what they're doing. Everything has to be transparent. You can't be having the chief of police make a decision before there's an investigation as to whether or not the use of force in the field was appropriate. You've got to have people that can trust the chief. The only way you establish trust is through transparency and engagement. For me, that's what my life has been about, building trust, making opportunities to build bridges exist where they haven't existed in the past. It's no longer about Democrats, Republicans, police over. It's about building trust. And at the end of the day, that comes with transparency and engagement.
Thank you. Ms. Wheeler-Dykesel, the question on police culture to you.
Yes, thank you. There are so many things that seem related and unrelated. One of the things that I know is very troubling to many police officers is the fact that there's only one union in Albuquerque. And perhaps, as has been tried out and done successfully in other municipalities, there should be a separate union for rank and file officers and those who are higher level. Perhaps, and we should examine that carefully. That's one issue. Another is that we have been asking police to do more and more things that do not involve policing. We've got to give police officers support to do the kinds of jobs that are not theirs, like being behavioral health professionals, being medical professionals, and that sort of thing. We've got to free them from those kinds of duties as quickly as possible when they come on scenes. Also, leadership is a very, very important thing. Transparency is very important. And the Citizens Police Oversight Committee, examining crimes after the fact, they have to be given say-so when police behavior is under examination that really matters.
Thank you. Michelle Garcia-Holmes.
Well, it's interesting to hear everybody's comments because I actually worked in the police department for 20 years and worked in a police department back in 1984 to 2003 when we were considered one of the premier police departments of the Southwest. I worked under community policing, a community policing model that worked. We were very in touch with our communities. We had good neighborhood watch programs. We knew who the block captains were. We were able to communicate with them to solve crimes in the community. You know, police culture has changed over the years, and I've watched it change. But what I've seen happen in our police department is a reduction in staff, and now our police officers are reactive. They are not proactive, like the community policing model requires. And we need our officers to have support. They need support right now. Some of these guys are answering calls by themselves with no backup. When I used to answer calls, same exact type of calls with 3 officers, sometimes 4. It's a tough world we're living in because we're dealing with more violent criminals, more drug-addicted criminals that are brazen, and these officers have to react in a matter of a few seconds. And then people get to look at their reaction for hours and analyze it. And these officers are human too. We need to understand that. I think we need to look at good management, good leadership. You know, when I worked in the police department, we had good leadership that if we were untruthful or if something happened in the police department, we were disciplined. Officers even sometimes fired because they were untruthful. We need to restore trust with the community. They need to understand that officers just want to do their job. Most officers, when you ask them when they apply, I used to work in recruiting and do these interviews, they apply and you ask them, why do you want to be a police officer? You know what their answer is? The majority of the time, because I want to help people. That's their answer. So that's why these guys and gals get in this job. I know I probably took a little more time, sorry.
Thank you. We're going to mix it up format-wise just a little bit. This is a show of hands question. And I think you've all already answered the first one, but it'll be in 2 parts. So the first one is raise your hand if you plan to hire a new police chief immediately at APD. I want to expand that just a little bit. How many of you, by a show of hands, would support changing some amount of the rest of the command structure at APD?
Most of them retire when a new mayor comes in, so FYI.
Fair point. And this is just another quick answer. I think Councilor Lewis has already answered this question. In terms of the way the officers at APD currently are apportioned, I think I heard Councilor Lewis say that he would like to see 60% of the staff at APD assigned to field services. I just want to hear what that breakdown is from the rest of you. As it stands right now, fewer than half of our officers are assigned to the Field Services Bureau. That's a reduction over a long period of time, and it's also outside the norm of police departments similar to our size and our kind of cities. So what is that breakdown for you, starting with field services versus specialized teams? And we'll start with you.
Well, it depends on what police model you use. I think the police model that's been used by the existing mayor is a very bad one, and it's real obvious to us. What I would base my policing model on is I would look at crime calls for service and the severity of those crimes as well. Because if you're dealing with certain types of crimes, you're going to want more officers working in that area. And we have, once again, I'm going to say I'm very data-driven. So I would look at the data and analyze exactly how many officers we need in the field to actually answer the calls for service that we're getting in. It's all data-driven, and easily you can look at that and decide, okay, we need less officers here, more officers there. The problem that we have right now is we don't have the officers to move around or juggle around. We just don't have it. And that's why I think it's so important that we have a mayor that understands exactly how all of these issues work. Not someone that is it's gonna take time for them to learn exactly how all this process functions.
Thank you. Dan Lewis, I think you've said 60-40.
Yeah, but over 60% that are in field services, 5% in our, no more than 5% in our command staff and leadership, 5% recruitment, training, and retention, and ensuring that our detectives are doing investigative work. And anybody that's not doing that, honestly, they're a civilian, should be civilian. Unless you're behind a desk on injury or something like that. I mean, there are a lot of positions that should be civilian jobs. If they're not investigating, responding to calls, doing real police work, so over 60%, but also, keep in mind that we restructure and ensure that every detective is investigating crimes, gathering evidence, and going to court.
Yes or no? Would you have your detectives responding to normal calls for service?
In the course of their job, sometimes that's required in the course of a detective's job, in gathering evidence and being proactive, and so that would be a part of it.
Gus Pedrati.
So, pushing 60 mid, 60 high, that puts us more in line with what other departments do for points of service in the field. Yes, of course. Reducing administrative clout and oversight is really important because we want to, again, bring in that civilian oversight. And the fourth thing that I forgot to mention was DOJ mandate. That's the other fourth thing we're all saying. And that includes that oversight from civilians, and it also includes a special master, which would take politics out of hopefully finishing that. But what we can also expect from that is seeing a better breakdown, or going back to the percentages, if we're 60 mid as far as on-the-ground officers who are responding to events, obviously, yes, situational awareness, we can put detectives out to respond to calls, but also saying that the units that we create and the percentages that we delegate there are reflexive towards our community needs, right? We can't say that we have a massive department for an issue that isn't plaguing our city if that's just not the case. But of course, more people in the field, more points of service, more contacts in our community that aren't emergency responses.
Mr. Keller?
I think, let me start with this because I mentioned it before. It depends on how you count the numbers, but I want 100%. I want every officer answering a call. And that includes the chief, that includes detectives, and it includes me. I've been on several ride-alongs, and I'm happy to go with them so that I can actually get a feel, whether it's once a week or once every 2 weeks, what's actually going on in the street. Now, obviously, that's on sort of a per-hour basis. So, but I do believe too, and maybe this is a big difference between us, I think we need to do community policing. You have to be around 80-20. At the end of the day, if you want to actually know your officer and know their name and they know you and they know the community, the history of the community, whether they're an immigrant community or an African-American community or a low-income community or a high-income community, or whether they're from that community, you've got to have the vast majority of your officers responding to calls in a specific neighborhood to get to know that community. That's the only way to do community policing. Everything else is what we have been doing, which is trying to use data to get around actual police work.
Thank you. Brian Colon.
I don't know that the percentages are as important as the leadership and the model, which says, yes, we're all going to be engaged in field services, but at the end of the day, we've got to make sure that we're focusing and the budget for law enforcement actually reflects our values. And if we value community policing, the police officers have to be in the streets. The command staff has actually expanded. We created this new tier of leadership. We have their majors now. Why? It was more opportunities to put people into positions that were not necessarily classified prior to that. So at the end of the day, we've got to make sure that our special units are pushing back on crime that's existing in our streets now. I do believe that the special units are important. I do believe that property crimes are increasing because we're not able to investigate and respond to these calls. There is a dramatic increase, and there appears to be a correlation between the lack of staffing in our special units and crime on the streets of Albuquerque. So look, until we can get the staffing where it needs to be in Albuquerque, which a lot of us talk about 1,200 officers, we've got to increase collaboration at every level, whether it's the federal or the county level. We're Bernalillo County Sheriff. We've got to work more collaboratively across the board.
Thank you. Susan Wheeler Dykesel.
My due diligence suggests that we actually need around 1,300 police officers, but I don't know that we should be splitting hairs on those numbers particularly. And it also suggests that 60% in the field is roughly an average for our size of population. But we are dealing right now with a situation that is where we are in crisis, we are short-staffed, and it's not going to be suddenly that we're back up to where we need to be. I suspect that it'll take about 5 years to get us up to the levels that we need to be, and we'll find out what they are as we go. And I also believe very strongly in our Public Service Aid 2 positions who will relieve our sworn officers of a lot of the mundane duties that they've been expected to do for a long, long time. If we could get their numbers up beyond the 14 that are part of a pilot excuse me, project right now, and up to somewhere around 100, perhaps more, and our crime scene investigators that will also relieve officers of some of the mundane tasks that will allow them to do policing more. I also want to emphasize, though, that with all of these things, I would prioritize the use of data, AKA high tech, but also high touch, community policing on every level. Every cop gets to know every individual that belongs in a neighborhood and that lives there, and they get to know their names, and they get to know the cops' names. They know how to contact them directly. These kinds of relationship-building situations are essential if we're going to have a healthy, safe neighborhood and city to live in as we go forward.
Thank you.
I want to button down this idea of a number of officers. Susan just mentioned 1,300. I think somebody else mentioned 1,200. Let's get everybody on the record fairly what they think the right number is. But then can I also get an answer as how do you get to that number, starting with Michelle Garcia Holmes? What's the right number of officers for you in Albuquerque?
Well, it depends on what kind of policing you want. I really do love the community policing model. It was something I worked under, like I said before. I would like to see us go back to that model someday, but I truly believe to be able to do a proper community policing model for the city, the size city we live in, you would need about 1,300 officers to do a well-structured. Back in the day when I served with the police department, I sat on the union board, and I've been looking at the numbers back then. And we actually did a study on how many officers we needed when we did the community policing model. And we did a study because we utilized that information because we wanted more police officers. And if you remember under the day of Mayor Martin Chavez, he was always trying to reach 1,000. Right. And I think that's because they were budgeted for 1,000. Right now we're budgeted for 1,000. I would like to see us achieve 1,000 officers. Anytime you're doing community policing, you need a certain amount of officers per capita, per individuals. So I would really like to see us get to our budgeted 1,000 and then evaluate where we need to go just prior to us reaching that number. So we're prepared and we're budgeted so that we can get the budget increase for the next amount of officers.
Martha?
Before the rest of you answer, I would like to add a little tweak to this question. Has anyone here on this stage looked at other cities who are comparable to Albuquerque in population? And I can name two, Atlanta proper and Buffalo, New York. Obviously, as almost every other city in the United States, has a lower crime rate than Albuquerque. Does anyone here know, or have you looked at or thought about looking at what is their crime rate in relation to the number of police officers they have, and could we learn something from those other cities? Not just those two, but there are several that are roughly comparable to us in population.
You know, I was the first candidate, I think, to say 1,200, but there was science behind it. It wasn't just thrown out of the air or grabbed out of the air. And to answer your question about the city, and that's where that came from. When we looked at El Paso, the city of El Paso, at a time when we had 38 police-involved shootings, high murder rate. The city of El Paso had 2 at that time, but also one of the safest cities in America and right across the border from the most dangerous city in the entire world. But the ratio was 25 police officers for every 10,000 people. And so you look at Colorado Springs, we looked at best practices and what agencies that were doing community policing, what kind of ratio do they have? And so 1,200 actually came out of that kind of science and data and looking at what cities that are successfully performing community policing with very quick response rates to emergency calls and low crime rates. So we looked at that, and that's a number that came out of the science and the data of looking at what cities were doing, the population, the amount of police officers that they had, and the goal that we need to get to very quickly.
Getting back on track, Gus, and for perspective, we're at about 850 now for officers. So what's your number, and how did you get to that number?
The range that's always been presented to me was between 1,100 and 1,300. Yeah. And yes, it's by that same per capita, the 25 per. For me, it's saying that if that's the number we need to restore back to when we gave better community services, if that's how we approach the actual points of contact that allow us to actually declare that we are doing community policing, that's the number we pursue. As far as looking at other cities go and different models, I think that's so important. I'm never going to diminish data or what works other places. I'm going to apply it to our context and see if that's something we can actually do here. Not blindly slap it on, but really look critically at this. Just like we did with hepatitis C, how we treated it in Albuquerque, now the rest of the world is changing their system towards it. We have to look other places. We don't have all the answers. One place to look is also Salt Lake City, of course. Very famous now for what their de-escalation training has done to their police response. And as we get more cops, as we focus towards community policing, we can start to see that de-escalation being effective. And that's, again, how that comes down to the question of how do we get to this number? Because we don't want to do it overnight, because we need new training in the academy. Our budget currently only allows us to get 100 new police officers a year right now. Also, there are requirements into the police academy that we can readdress, like the polygraph if we're really interested in recruiting locally. There are all these ways that we can start seeing more recruitment from our own communities, interested in protecting and serving their own communities instead of poaching off of other departments who might have different cultures and different responses, and also ensure that we grow in the same timeline that it takes us to change our education to reinforce de-escalated community policing.
Appreciate that. Tim Keller, same question. What's your number and how do you get there?
I looked at this same sort of studies, and I think the number is very similar. I saw between 1,000 and 1,400. And you can look at it per violent crime. So obviously, as per violent crime goes down, then you need less officers, but then it can go back up because you have fewer officers. But I think it is a little bit of a moving target, and so I think a range is appropriate. But I think the important thing is how we actually get this done. And so our crime plan is very thorough on this point. It's 9 pages long, and we're going to get rid of the position of major, because for every major, we can have 2 more frontline officers. We're going to fill the 10% vacancies that we have now already. And we've got to look at that entire pipeline of recruitment. So on the front end, how can we use state standards instead of city standards, which are different, so that we have the same standards all around the state, and that'll allow folks to get in to fill the pipeline? How do we get some lateral hires who probably already live here? They just work in Rio Rancho and Los Lunas. And then how do we retain our best officers at the end of their career? Those are the areas that actually get us up to numbers that big. And I think at the end of the day, I don't want to underemphasize this point. We say we want to have officers back and we want to, be there for them. What they have told me is they want fairness when it comes to the top and how they're disciplined and how they're promoted. And now that has gotten subjective. So if you want more applicants, you got to get down into the HR weeds and the policy weeds and root that out. That's what they respect, because it's an SOP-driven culture. And so until you go to that level, we're going to have a police shortage.
Brian Colon, your number, how do you get there?
So I think I mentioned the 1,200, and that wasn't random. I think it was the Weiss or the Weiss report that indicated that that was an appropriate number for the city of Albuquerque. And I think that I do agree with that number. From the folks that I've spoken to and the experts, including individuals with the National Chiefs Association, Police Chiefs Association that have been giving me some guidance on the crime plan that our team released 6 weeks ago that included guidance from retired police officers, retired police chiefs, community leaders, and officers on the streets of Albuquerque today. You know, I think one of the things we need to make sure that we do is we have a department that reflects our city. And unfortunately, we don't. So I want to see us have 2 academies a year. I want to see us take 30 months to get to that 1,200 number. And we can do that if we increase our academies. But we need to be careful about the recruiting that we do, because for me, it matters when people are interacting with the police department, it has to look like they're looking in the mirror. And that comes to gender equity, it comes to cultural equity, and it means to make sure that we have a morale in our department where APD officers are not going to pinning ceremonies, putting a badge from the Bernalillo County Sheriff's Department on their daughter or their son or their niece or their nephew. So until we change the culture and the way we approach our police department, we won't be able to increase recruitment. So at the end of the day, it's about leadership, saying we're making a deep commitment to having the world-class department that this community deserves. That's when we're going to increase recruitment, retention, and capacity to build to 1,200 officers within 30 months.
Susan?
30 months, that's good. I like that.
Thank you.
I'm not kidding, that's a great goal. My number of 1,300 also came from data and also from anecdotal information that I gathered around the policing community. And I do believe that what Brian says is absolutely correct. Our police department should reflect our population and our culture here. And how do we do that? One of the ways we do that, I believe, is going back to, as Gus suggested, polygraphing. I've talked to recruiters who have mentioned instances where what seemed to be perfectly qualified applicants were knocked out because of something very small and very old. And if there were other ways of re-examining, or these applicants are allowing them to come in another way and to prove their worth to the department, that would be so much more helpful than relying on grabbing from other areas. Thank you.
Good deal. Martha Burke.
Yes, we're going to move on now, and we'll start with Dan Lewis. I want to talk to you about immigration. The DOJ, the Attorney General, has recently called Albuquerque a sanctuary city. He has implied that we will lose a good deal of federal funding if local resources are not used to back up immigration law. And I just want to know how you would handle the whole issue, but particularly how would you deal with the federal government on this issue with what's coming out of Washington right now?
The city of Albuquerque, by policy, is not a sanctuary city.
Right.
The county.
Apparently, Jeff Sessions thinks we are.
Because Bernalillo County, by policy, is a sanctuary county by the definitions that are most commonly used. I voted in 2011. I supported the current standard operating procedure, which is that we would cooperate with ICE agents in the transfer center. I think it with very little resources, it's sensitive to the issue, the sensitive issue. But it is not the job of Albuquerque police officers to enforce immigration. It's the federal government's job to do that. At the same time, I don't believe that APD or the City of Albuquerque should hinder that job. And so I think we have a good procedure, a good policy. Now, whether the federal government chooses to cooperate with us in that way, that's up to them. And I think there was some, there could have been some wrong messages sent out rather than correcting, the Attorney General probably would have been better to, just reach out and clarify some of those things, to the Attorney General. And I think there was some miscommunication.
Thank you. Gus Pedrati, same question.
I'm not really worried about what or who calls us what. It's about standing up for all of our communities together, especially in a police department. We protect and serve all of ours equally. And we can see that this is beneficial for public safety nationally as well. LA, the mayor and the police chief just had one of the largest organized crime busts they've seen in their city recently, and it was because of the relationship they had with undocumented communities. When we choose to protect all of our communities, we gain trust in these departments. And BCSO, going back to that GHOST unit, cited the trust they had in their community as the most empowering moment in their ability to actually give effective care. Immediately we shut people off from feeling comfortable dialing 911, for talking about oppressive landlords or oppressive groups that are now preying on them, we lose as a city. We perpetuate that fake ideology that there is this underlying villainy in undocumented citizens where they are the hardest working that we have here. They pay taxes, they show up, and we need them to live undocumented and unafraid as ever they may please because we're going to stand up for that community.
Thank you. Tim Keller.
You know, for me, I have a long track record standing up for our immigrant communities, representing them in the International District, and I see this as no different. To me, it's a values issue to protect every family in our community, no matter what. It is also about community safety because you can't have trust, you can't have community policing if folks are afraid of being deported. And so I think it's actually an important tool to reduce crime. But I also think that a lot of us say this, and I'm sure that we mean it and we feel it, but how do you actually do that as a mayor? How do you really protect immigrants? I think we should have a city policy that says that no city employee or contractor of any kind has the right to inquire about someone's personal information. That includes health information, that includes documentation status. If you make that the policy of the city, you are by definition protecting those families. And that's what I want to do. That's the difference between action and just talking about it.
But back to the fundamental part of the question, how would you deal with the U.S. Department of Justice when they think you are a sanctuary city and you are being threatened with loss of funds?
You know, I'm not afraid of standing up to folks who are trying to bully us with a little bit of grant funding. And at the end of the day, I've got a track record of standing up to the powerful, whether it's as auditor or as state senator. And we have challenges in Albuquerque that we have to address. That's why I'm running for mayor. That's what I want to focus on. I'm not really concerned about what minor letter a attorney general is going to send us because I know we've got to address these issues on our own. If we're waiting for DC for some kind of grant program, that's the wrong strategy in the first place.
Thank you. Brian Colon.
Dr. Burke, this again is an issue that's very personal to me. You know, my wife is an immigrant and my wife is also a civil engineer with a master's in math. And every day she takes those degrees into the International District for 17 years to try and change the lives of students in one of the most diverse communities in Albuquerque. And many of those students, when they hear bullies on TV talking about deportation and sanctuary city, when they're out of her classroom, they're concerned whether they're going home to families or to empty homes. So at the end of the day, we have to make sure this is truly about policies and about real clear communication, not just about bullying tactics, not just rhetoric about what portion of our community is committing crime. At the end of the day, we're an immigrant-friendly city. It's part of our history. It's part of our story, and I embrace that. And I think the mayor has to send a clear message to the President of the United States to say Albuquerque has been and will be an immigrant-friendly city. You know, the problem with being an attorney and being up here is that I understand that when you just throw terms around like sanctuary city or immigrant-friendly, actually words have meaning, but they also have legal meaning. And this administration has made sanctuary city be a moving target. So at the end of the day, I'll proudly stand with the immigrant community and also say that APD's got to do its job and the feds need to do theirs.
Thank you. Susan Dyschel.
Thank you. This is an excellent question. And indeed, all of this is a moving target. I was most surprised when I heard that the Attorney General, the federal Attorney General, had insinuated that Albuquerque was a so-called sanctuary city. We have never adopted that policy. And that was a little puzzling, but considering what's going on in Washington, D.C., maybe I shouldn't be surprised. But, and an ICE desk does exist and has for a number of years at our not detention center, but our processing center, and I understand it's largely unstaffed. And that would be the choice of the federal government, whether or not they choose to staff that. But the larger question is, how do I feel about undocumented immigrants being with us and among us in our city? And to quote my friend, I want to say that we just don't have enough of them. They are such terrific components of our population, hardworking, tax-paying, reliable. I will stand to protect them and to serve them as their mayor.
Thank you. Michelle Garcia Holmes, you get the last word on this one.
The last word, nice. Well, I would not, as mayor, make Albuquerque a sanctuary city. I believe that we need to have every penny of crime-fighting funds that we can possibly get our hands on, especially with the drug problems that we have here, the methamphetamine that we're dealing with, the drug cartels that we have in our city, because that is the reality. We do have individuals here that are here illegally that are committing crimes. And I'm not saying that everyone who's an immigrant is here committing crimes. There are a lot of good citizens here. And I feel like when someone goes through the process to come to the United States legally, they are so excited about it. When I worked at the Attorney General's office, I would be invited to every one of the ceremonies, swearing-in ceremonies for individuals who went through the process to become legal citizens. And to see the looks on their faces and the accomplishment that they went through, it's priceless. And I think everyone should have an opportunity, a fair opportunity to do that. But as far as making Albuquerque a sanctuary city, I would not do that. And nor do I remember at any time as serving as a police officer that I ever dealt with ICE in that fashion.
Well,
it was always done at the jail.
The question, though, was not whether you would make us a sanctuary city, which we are not now. The question is, if the DOJ threatened you with loss of funds, would you allocate resources to enforce federal law?
What I would do is I would work with our congressional delegation, because I have worked with the DOJ before on various issues when I was with the Attorney General's office. And I think through good communication, we could establish a good process with the DOJ to do just what we need to do and clarify.
Good deal, Michelle. We'll start with you. Michelle Garcia-Holmes, we'll start with this next one. Downtown has been in the news the last few months, right? We had an infamous letter from Lavoo, one of our bright, shining technology companies here that we were all rooting for, sent the mayor a letter saying, we've got to do something here. There's been a lot of news coverage of this. I understand that, we have crime all over town. Let's talk about downtown for just one question here. If it's about homelessness, how do we deal with this, and how do we make downtown an entertainment district that's safe for families, safe for everybody, and get people served that might need them, meaning homeless folks, at the exact same time? What's your plan for downtown?
One of the things, I'm going to start with the homeless community, because I think we need to start there, because Lavoo was complaining about that. They were complaining about homeless issues, homeless people sleeping in their doorways, and et cetera, so on. I think one of the things we need to do is we need to collaborate with a lot of our groups that are working on that specific issue in our community. We need to bring all these individuals together and start, once again, I'm going to say it again, a lot of these non-governmental entities, a lot of these 501(c)(3)s are helping the homeless people with their short-term needs, but not their long-term needs. And I think that's where the mayor comes in. That's where the city comes in. And we start to assist all these NGOs in how can we work together? How can we start addressing the long-term needs? Where are these people coming from? Who are these people? Have they been sent here from other states? I know that was a big issue that we had a while back. Are they veterans? Can we get them connected with veteran services? So we have to start tackling that issue in that way, very thoughtful. And what I want to do is I want to hold a summit with all of these individuals and start bringing all these ideas to the table so that we can address the homeless issue.
Gotcha. Dan Lewis, same question. Downtown.
It starts with a presence, of ensuring that there's a presence there of officers that are walking a beat and that are seen as not as enforcers but as peacekeepers. Where people see a man or a woman wearing blue and that badge, they say there's somebody that's going to help me. There's somebody I can go to for help. But that's what it's going to take to be able to create the security, the safety that people feel downtown, and we have to start there. I'll mention Albuquerque Heading Home because I think it is an organization with some challenges, but I think it has the right intent to bring together all the organizations in the city of Albuquerque that can identify and help people that are homeless, and oftentimes, as we know, they're dealing with behavioral health issues, with drug addiction, alcoholism, with all kinds of challenges. So we want to be able to bring together the experts and the right people that could help them identify those needs, ensure that we can meet those needs, and then ultimately get them a safe place to live. And so I think we have to deal with it downtown those two ways. Downtown is one of our best opportunities to be able to really help this city thrive.
Gus, same thing.
Downtown faces a service issue. LAVU isn't talking about organized violent crime, it's about disparity, it's about a marginalized population. This is why the small clinic care model is so important. It's delivering a lower cost point to that care that can be ongoing. And it's saying we're now a front line for data as far as what services people are getting. We can corroborate nonprofit data and say, great, you are doing that. Maybe hold them accountable for ways that there might be redundant infrastructure or cracks, and get people set up with the services they need that are being provided by community experts. Furthermore, though, other things that we can do, and more on that small clinic care model if you'd like, check us out, gusformayor.com. But more than that, we can also do simple things like saying, let's actually get a locker base for people to go to where they have a permanent address now. They have a place where they can store a few simple things, maybe the money that they saved instead of being at risk for being robbed and mugged. We can also then make sure that when they access care, it's not just saying where do we put them for a night, where they then have to go find a food shelter and check in with someone, and they're running around all over the city without correct transit to support them to make it back to a shelter that may or may not have bed space for a night. One night isn't enough. One night doesn't cut it. And the housing voucher backlog is 2 years right now. So we need solutions that in fact bring up new developments, but also have that mid-range term limit so that we can get them into secure and long-range housing opportunities.
Tim Keller, same question.
I believe in the housing first model, which is basically that you stabilize an individual first and then you provide all those services, the behavioral health, the mental health, the job training and things like that into that. And that's what Heading Home does. But I think this is a really good example where we can study this, we can talk about plans, we can talk about models, we can talk about collaborating, having summits. This comes down to money. Budgets are a reflection of our values and our priorities. And this to me is really stark. You want to think about downtown? We're building that new fountain for $4 million downtown. And look, I know we needed a new fountain. That one's a little old. But for the price of that fountain, we could have given thousands of homeless individuals homeless vouchers. Those are the kinds of decisions we have to make differently. That's how we actually take action, and that's how we actually make a real difference. That's what I want to do as our next mayor.
Brian Colon, same question.
So I think at the end of the day, look, I've been looking through the lens of downtown for the last decade. My office has been downtown Albuquerque, and I've encountered everything from homeless individuals with obvious mental health concerns being on the street and making me feel unsafe, and I'm no small guy, to actually driving up in the morning to a crime scene, or what appeared to be a crime scene, and it was actually a homeless individual who'd passed away on the heating grate at the side of the building. Look, we have to make sure that we have the resources to be out in the streets of Albuquerque to help provide assistance and support to these individuals. It gets back to having a police department that's appropriately staffed, and then we gotta have triage for these individuals. I too have been a longtime advocate of a housing first model. Been working with ABQ Heading Home, and for those of us that have been in this sector, in this space for a long time, we know that what preceded that was the Metropolitan Homelessness Project. And my 19-year-old son, who's here with me today, we went out at 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning to go do a point in time count, to go around the community to find out how many homeless individuals are there in our city, so that we could try and identify the federal resources to address the issue. So let's get the people on the ground in the streets to get these folks who need our services and our care off the streets.
Same question.
I'd like to steer just a little bit away from this, even though there's nothing here that I dispute at all. And two things. First of all, no great city doesn't have a great downtown. So it's essential that we bring our downtown back 100%. And LAVU's concern was not just about homelessness. It was also about criminality and the fact that people couldn't walk to their cars without finding them vandalized and those sorts of things. Homeless folks aren't necessarily criminals, so we have to be very, very careful not to criminalize people that are homeless. Secondly, I agree with everything. We need on-site triage, we need housing. Housing, more than just housing, short-term vouchers, we need long-term for people to be able to live in places where they have a roof over their head, a door they can lock, and a bathroom with a toilet that can flush. That's absolutely essential, and it's the only proper way to treat other human beings.
A quick yes or no for everybody about downtown before I get to Martha Burke and her next question. This has come up quite a bit. You've just kind of triggered a memory here about bathroom facilities. There's been a lot of cities out there that are moving forward with providing homeless bathroom facilities in downtown cores. Sometimes they're actually on mobile units. There's a lot of new technologies that allow this to happen. Yes or no, starting with Michelle, would you support something like that for downtown? Because there is some resistance. People feel like they see a bathroom or the classic porta potty, they think it's a magnet for other problems. Would you support something like that? Does that solve a problem to you?
I haven't really thought about it before. I'm not sure what that would look like in my head. I just kind of had, possibly. I would have to look at it and the cost and how effective it would be. I would much rather spend money on collaborating and trying to help our homeless individuals and get the services they need than just taking care of short-term services.
Fair enough.
And that's pretty short
Dan
term.
Lewis? That's all right. What do you
Yes, I
think?
think there's a proper way to do that. I think it's an issue of compassion as well as just cleanliness and being able to ensure that downtown is clean and thriving.
There you go. Gus Bergiotti?
Most of us bolt into establishments with all of our privilege just to pee.
Right.
I can't imagine what that would be like on the other side. Of course, I support restrooms.
Tim Keller?
You know, I do too, and I think that's also why we need to actually have a city-run homeless center that's year-round and adequate and provides all these kinds of services, because at the end of the day, we're a big city. We should start acting like it instead of pretending that we're just a small town and this is a temporary thing.
Right. Brian Colon, you understand being downtown. A lot of the problem is there's defecating going on in alleys and other places downtown, and this is where this idea comes from, that it's a difficulty for downtown folks. Do you support this idea?
I do, and I was just visiting with the owners of Gertrude Zachary's, and they said the same thing, that they come in time and time again to a mess, and it's because there's a lack of access. And Gus, I appreciate you always reminding us about our lens of privilege, even those of us who are first cycle to have broken the generations of poverty that preceded us. I'm for bathrooms, and I say buy local. There you go.
It can be invented locally.
Get them produced and manufactured right here now.
That's right.
Very good. I agree with the idea of bathrooms, and I can't imagine any urban space that I've ever visited that has been in the developed world that didn't have public restrooms that were also accessed by people that did not live in homes. Many countries also staff them, and those are jobs for people who can't work in other settings, and those are really viable jobs. I think this city, and by the way, I worked on a committee for a while with the Downtown Action Team talking about this very sort of weighty question. When I go out in public, I don't want to be limited to an hour and a half, or I have to go somewhere or go home. I also want to be able to access public restrooms. So then we bring up the question of homeless individuals. I think that probably, at least for the short term, we probably need to start thinking about permanent installations of public restrooms, perhaps considering service models, but also other places where homeless individuals can go to take care of all of their needs. I would think of them as day centers, night centers that have all sorts of services available, including toilet facilities and washing facilities.
Appreciate that from everybody. Thank you. Martha Burke, next question.
Yeah, we're going to move on to the a project that whoever is elected will inherit, and that's the art project, and we don't mean paintings on the wall. We mean Albuquerque Rapid Transit. And it may be finished, actually, by the time one of you takes office, but regardless, you will inherit the realities of what was envisioned for the project when it started. And it's been touted as an economic development engine. How would that factor into your long-range plans for economic development in the city? And we will start with Susan Dyschel.
Thank you, because this transit project is a conversation that I've been having with the City of Albuquerque consultants and all other consultants and members of the public for over 6 years, and that's one of the reasons that I am such an ardent supporter of this project. When I first entered the conversation, more than 6 years ago. It was just an idea about improving transit in the city and trying to figure out which community it could serve best and in which ways and how we could afford it and what it would look like and that sort of thing. And eventually it became what we now refer to as the ART project. That sent me deep into study, not only of urban design, transit design, but also what kinds of economic factors and drivers brought cities, especially cities that were in decline, similar to ours with similar demographics, to a point that they experienced real tangible turnaround. And it was something just like this. I completely support it, and as your mayor, I will also support Part 2 and Part 3. Part 2 is already designed, it's a north-south route, and I think I've run out of time.
Thank you. Michelle Garcia Holmes, your plans for the ART project and its potential.
Well, I never would have supported the ART project, not when we have a crime problem in our city. And this is something that I've given a lot of thought to. I've watched it progress over time. I live off of Mountain Road in the Old Town area and have to drive all the way up to the west side to visit my mom through the project up Central Avenue. And I still am not seeing a vision of a money-making item for our city. I think this is a tough project that the next mayor is going to have to deal with. Transit projects don't generate funds for your city.
Though it's a tough project, you're going to have to deal with it. How are you going to do that?
Well, one of the things I want to do, Martha, is I would like to make it free after 5. To encourage the community members to ride the transit system, maybe ride it from, after they get off work, ride it from the west side all the way to maybe Tractor Brewery. Maybe it'll cut down on our DWI issues. I think that's probably a really great plan at this point to do something like that.
Thank you very much. Dan Lewis.
The idea was first presented about 7 years ago, and it was called the BRT. And it was a line that went from the west side of Albuquerque to the Journal Center and then downtown. And at the very least, it had the intention of solving some problems, some real needs in our city and solving those issues. Well, it came up several years later as the ART, not to solve any problems, but a beautification project that would hopefully bring in federal dollars, but also bring in investment. And as mayor, the next mayor is going to have a completed ribbon cut project. And the best that we can do right now is to do everything we can to minimize the damage to businesses along that corridor, but also to use the data to ensure that the configuration of the roadway and the economic value and benefit of it, that we can see that data. And so that's why I introduced a bill that we're going to take a good hard look and analyze how the roadway worked, the economic development and the investment before the project was complete and after the project's complete, to give those business owners the assurance that the project will do what they say it's going to do, and that is millions of dollars in private investment that would come into that corridor. So I'll make sure that it does what it says it's going to do. And if it doesn't, we'll have the ability to be able to open up directed lanes to general traffic in some areas and be able to cut turn lanes where we need it to. But it's going to take good leadership to ensure that whatever is there ultimately is successful.
Thank you. Mr. Pedrati.
First of all, ART had almost no due process, and it's something that I hope none of us would ever move forward with any administration with. What can we do with it, though? Yes, it is here. First of all, of course, we connect it to the airport more reliably. If we want public transit to be used for tourism, we need to make sure it's a quick and easy access point. Also, what else can we do to attract ridership onto these platforms? This may sound benign, but it's not. If we actually redo the platforms, we can either use these weird swoopy tent structures as a base or repurpose them in parks as shade structures and let neighborhoods instead develop and design their platforms. Each one becomes unique, a tourist destination, presents the community, allows them input, and now there's more incentive to actually get off the platform and explore the surrounding neighborhood. Public transit only works if you're getting on and off in new places, and that's the fundamental issue here. We also look at Bricklight Nights, which happens on Harvard off of Central. It's their resilience towards what's going on with art, and it's hugely successful on Wednesday nights. There are discounts, there's live music, there are street vendors, which also helps a lot of our at-risk populations, and we can have rotating city-sponsored community nights at different platforms to try and get our normal communities here, not just tourism, on the bus and then off in new places that they wouldn't normally go.
Thank you very much. Tim Keller.
You know, actually, so far, a lot of our ideas seem to be merging. And so I think that's an excellent idea. It's something I support as well. And especially having neighborhoods have their own ownership and artists owning that local stop, I think is so important, and rebranding it around the Mother Road. But for me, look, the way this came down was absolutely the wrong way to govern. But as you mentioned, we have to deal with it. And so I do think there are pragmatic things that the new mayor needs to do. We've got to revisit the left-hand turns. That is what is crushing businesses. And I think we should revisit that and add a bunch to help those businesses survive. We've got to look at the dedicated lane issues to make sure that we don't have to have those every place in town. But I think most importantly, I support public transit for public transit's sake. And it's great that the feds paid for a lot of this. But that's why this has to work for commuters. And right now, the most popular route in the system is Cottonwood Mall over to C&M. And this won't even go on that. And so that's why I think the ART should run on the Rapid Ride route, because then it's also going to work for commuters and all of these other things we just heard about. Now, if we do that, we also have to understand there's a money problem. The new mayor better be able to find $19 million. And so that's why I think we need to take it to the airport. One, it should have gone there in the first place. Two, we can bond against the airport. And that's the only way we're going to pay for this without raising taxes.
Wrap this one up, Brian Colon.
All right, well, I'll just say that I do think the art was a debacle, and I think largely because of a lack of community engagement. This is yet another project where this administration failed to engage community. Whether it's the art system or whether it's the North Valley Waste Transfer Station, this community is disengaged from our city's leadership. That's not my style of governance.
What are you going to do?
And what I'm going to do about
art?
the art project, because the ribbon is going to be cut. And I've already told folks that we're going to take a deep breath. Wherever we're at that point in time, we're going to stop. We're going to get the engineers back around the table and say, how can we reconfigure this so it works for our community? I don't believe it's going to work the way it's been configured to date. I've said that those white sails are just offensive to me. They could be in anywhere in America, and they shouldn't be in Albuquerque, New Mexico. We need to tell our story if we're going to have this system running on the old Route 66. Each of those platforms ought to tell our story, and not a single one of them will with those, what did Gus call them? The wind sails. We'll call them wind sails, but they're just absolutely offensive. Until we make the buses safe in Albuquerque, people like me and my wife, even though I carry a bus pass, we're not going to occupy the bus. So we've got to bring public safety to our transit system tomorrow.
Thank you very much. Since I cut you off a bit on that one, I'm going to give you the first shot at the next one.
I'll take it.
All right. We know now that there will be an item on the ballot so that employers must allow accrual of credits toward sick leave, paid sick time for part-time or full-time employees. Do you support that measure? And if you do, tell us why, and if you don't, tell us why not.
Sure. Dr. Burke, I think, again, this is failed leadership. I think that the leaders of our city of Albuquerque should have brought stakeholders to the table to come up with a workable ordinance. I am going to be voting for this ordinance personally, but at the end of the day, the voters of Albuquerque get to decide. And if they pass this ordinance, it'll be our job as the leadership of Albuquerque to implement the organization or to implement the ordinance. We'll bring those stakeholders to the table to make sure we can implement it in the best way possible. I will tell you, as a lawyer, and after having read over those 7.5 pages quite extensively, or 6.5 pages quite extensively, I'm very concerned about the constitutionality of that statute, of that ordinance. And I think it's going to need some work. And I don't think you can pass an ordinance in perpetuity. That just isn't okay. And I think that we're going to be in court over this if we don't engage the community on how we can properly implement it so that it works for everybody. I'm concerned about our small businesses, but I'm also concerned about the welfare and safety of our families. Look, my wife's a school teacher. She doesn't want people going to work sick. My employees never had to go work sick because we had a sick leave policy. I think that most business owners I talk to still have a policy on their own, but this one, it's overreaching, but I think it's important to send a message that we support sick leave.
Thank you. Susan?
Thank you. For many years, I worked at low-wage, minimum wage jobs in which I received no benefits whatsoever, so that, of course, included sick leave. I went to work sick because I needed the money that I worked for. So I really understand what it's like to walk in those shoes. I went on to own a small business where I had employees. When I was the employer, I made concessions to myself, so to speak, and I assured that my employees had the opportunity to accrue paid time off. So I've been on both sides of that. Eventually, though, I let go of that business because it was so expensive to operate for the business expenses, the allowing people time off, insurance, and all of the various regulatory fees. It just wasn't a going proposition. So back to our particular proposed ordinance. We need to be able to figure out ways to pay for this. We need to draft a bill that can stand up to judicial scrutiny.
Thank you so much. Michelle Garcia Holmes, you're next.
Well, I believe the Healthy Workforce Ordinance is going to actually hurt our economy, and it's going to hurt small business. It's going to hurt businesses, or it's going to prevent businesses from wanting to come to Albuquerque to start up here because they're going to look at more regulation. I believe businesses should have the prerogative and be able to negotiate their own employment statuses when they hire individuals. I think we have constitutional issues, like Brian mentioned. I attended the last hearing and listened, and it's going to go all the way up to the state Supreme Court, and we'll just have to see what happens. But I will not be voting for this ordinance.
Dan Lewis, what about you?
Well, the vast majority of companies in our city take care of their families, they take care of their workers. Unfortunately, this bill, this Sick Leave Act, will not help families, and it certainly won't help the job creators, the businesses that help those families. I mean, this was specifically written by people not from New Mexico, but outside of our state who. And have done this in many states, and what they do is you can't get it done in a state legislature, which really these kinds of HR and labor type of laws should be done at a state level anyway, so we don't checkerboard these different policies. But they'll say we can get somebody, a city councilor, somebody in Albuquerque that'll carry our water and be able to push this through. And so we have an ordinance, a possible ordinance that does have all kinds of legal challenges and certainly not something I think is good for the people of Albuquerque, for families, for children, and certainly for the job creators. There's a better way that we can take care of our families. Unfortunately, this doesn't do that.
Mr. Pedrati.
Unfortunately, we still haven't stepped up and made a way previously. So of course, yes, I have to stand up for sick leave in our communities, especially coming from minimum wage jobs, coaching water polo, wondering if I should be in a pool with 12-year-olds if I had been throwing up or if it would cost me my job. I mean, these are decisions we don't want to be making. These are decisions employers don't want us to be tasked with. We need communities to come together and be supported in all facets of their lives. So yes, of course, I'll support this. Yes, I also recognize that right now there is a lot of contention around this issue. However, the city neglected its responsibility to address this head-on. Ballot initiatives that come up through petition are not a secret. The city could have convened more stakeholders, could have been involved in this discourse, and effectively we didn't, and now we're left here. So of course, I will vote for it, and then as mayor, I will be sure to, if it is required, go into litigation over this ordinance. But we have to stand up for our communities, we have to stand up for the health of our communities, and I will be voting yes.
Thank you. Mr. Keller.
As a father of a 2- and a 4-year-old and with a family that my wife works full-time and so do I, this is very, very important. And it is, sick leave is something that actually typically helps productivity, not hurts it. And we know all too well what happens when any one of the 4 of us gets sick. Now, luckily, we have enough privilege in our lives where we're not penalized for that. But I know exactly what that would mean if we were. It means the whole family is out of work, and those kids don't have parents who earn a living. That's how important this is. Now, that said, I think we've heard a little bit about this. These issues come up because the mayor literally won't propose an alternative. And that's what I'll do as mayor. That's what I've done. I know how to do that from the state senate and from being auditor. You propose an alternative that you think is better. That's what I'll do as mayor, and I think that's what's needed all along. And that's what we're going to have to do, because I do think there's long-standing legal issues with this.
Okay, we're going to move on to another question of economics for the workers in the city. The city currently has the first gender pay equity initiative for contractors in the United States. And I would like to know whether you support the initiative, and if so, what you would do to improve it, if anything. How do you think it's working, and what do you have to say about it in general? Go ahead, Mr. Keller. I'll start with you.
You know, I think this is a pride point for the city of Albuquerque. And of course, in the state auditor's office, we've looked at this statewide, and we see how far ahead Albuquerque is in the country and ahead of the state. And so I think that is a good thing that we should be proud of. But how do we build onto that, and how do we make it real so that there's actual penny for penny pay equity? That's the end goal. And so for me, there's a couple of things. Number one, we have to get rid of some of these issues that drive pay inequity. And a lot of that has to do with whether or not you're allowed to ask employers in government, you look at your previous salary and you can only give people a certain salary up. We have to get rid of that, because that not only discriminates against women on average, it also discriminates of anyone of color. And it frankly prevents rising stars from rising as fast as they should. And so that's something that I want to do on day one as mayor. And I think there's a couple of other pieces here too about, in general, having a city leadership that reflects Albuquerque, both on a race equity basis and a gender equity basis. And I'm committed to that as mayor. So the other piece around this too that I don't want to lose is just this. We have to transparently disclose how close we're getting to one-for-one pay equity every year, and put a plan forth on how to actually get there. And that's what's missing.
Thank you. Brian Colon, your thoughts?
Well, Dr. Burke, you've been educating me on this issue for many years, and you've educated the country on this issue of pay equity. And you're a shining star in New Mexico because of your leadership on this issue. First thing I do is continue to have you at the table as Albuquerque makes progress. Okay, so look, it seems silly that we even wonder whether or not there should be equal pay for equal work between genders. I mean, to me, that is just common sense. Why are we having this conversation? It's 8 minutes of wasted time. At the end of the day, that's just not a question. But what is important to know is that we can't just be committed to that, but we have to have also equity in positions. So in other words, we have to have in the leadership of the city of Albuquerque, we have to have gender equity in the leadership positions. Because again, you have to have people reflect our city when they look at city leadership. I mean, the city has to look at the leadership of Albuquerque and know that it's looking in a mirror. Whether you're a young woman of color in Albuquerque, or whether you are a young man of color in Albuquerque, the leadership of the city of Albuquerque ought to look like you. And so we've got to make sure we have that diversity in Albuquerque's leadership, and I'll make sure that happens from day one.
Thank you. Before we move to the next answer, I have to say that, tell the audience that our producers chose the questions. I was not angling for a job offer.
I said you could volunteer, didn't I?
Oh, okay. No money involved. Susan Wheeler Deichel.
Thank you. Thank you. It is a great point of pride that we are so close to equity with respect to pay in Albuquerque. One of the good lists we're on, and I'm very proud of that. And I'm kind of with our state auditor and Brian Colon on this. I don't believe I have anything in particular to add, except more of that.
Thank you. Michelle Garcia Holmes.
Well, pay equity is very important. Being a female, working in different systems, working in male-dominated systems for most of my career, definitely pay equity is important. I like what Brian said. He said we need equity in leadership. You know, it's sad to say, but early on in the campaign, I found out that there has never been a woman mayor in the city of Albuquerque. It's time for a woman mayor. I think that'll make a difference in our city. I support gender pay equity, and I just want to share a story with you. When I was with the New Mexico Attorney General's office and I got a position as the chief of staff, the first thing we did was a salary study to look at pay equity, and we addressed the issue very aggressively in the first budget that we handled. So I'm very proud of that fact. Thanks for the question, whoever asked it.
Thank you so much. Dan Lewis.
I voted for the bill, I helped craft the bill, and I helped ensure that it became law in the city of Albuquerque. And now we have to make sure that the outcomes are what was intended in that ordinance, so that we look at the outcomes, that's having the benefit for both workers and for and for businesses. And I will have an administration that's very diverse, that reflects the type of companies that I've led over the years, and the privilege of hiring, employing with high-paying jobs, very diverse, workers in this community. And so I'm very, very grateful for that and to be able to have that opportunity.
Last word, Gus Pedrati.
Thank you. Oftentimes, our city can pass wonderful things, and we don't actually see them through. And that's been seen in some of our minimum wage adjustments previously. We have to be sure that we commit to this, not just in what we write and what we say, but in the actions as well. And this is a systemic issue. Obviously, there are going to be things that we have to really get into the weeds about when it comes down to hiring or pay raises and how we promote through different departments and through our city and what that means for how high people can go and what their salaries will become. Systemic issues, though, start in so many places beyond where people are today. And so, of course, yes, we're going to have a representative government. Every single time, we have to be sure that we are promoting people from every single walk of life to take on the initiatives that they're interested in and passionate about. But we also have to start with representation even at lower levels and make sure there's equal access to all sorts of educational opportunities for everybody equally. And that comes down to especially STEM fields. Studying chemistry at UNM, there was definite disparity in that field in classrooms. And those are things we need to shift because that's about visibility. When we say that we want a representative government where we see ourselves, that happens everywhere. Because if you don't see yourself in a position, you don't believe you can get there. And so we can change that in a whole different amount of ways through education specifically.
Thank you.
Well done. We're big fans of Martha Burks, too. That's why she's on our team. We love her. All right, this is the point where we're going to allow a minute for what you might consider a rebuttal, or if there's something you want to add to what you've said tonight. This is not the closing statement. We've got that quite next. But Gus, starting with you, we just finished, but starting with you, something you want to add to what you've told folks here tonight. 1 minute. Mm-hmm.
Gonna dig in real quick. I know I talk fast. Everybody buckle your seats. Whew. All right. For me, we've totally had a reflexive conversation so far. It has only been issues that have been asked and answered. The DOJ mandate, public safety experts have already weighed in on these issues. This is all data we're feeding back to you that has been fed to us. This is obscene to me that we haven't talked about real vision for this city. Some of the things we can start doing immediately. We can literally legalize marijuana as a city to enact entire green energy infrastructure around us, which diminishes gentrification because we can double down with the private sector and ensure that they, instead of buying up property, also take this investment on. We can also look to new international relationships for pharmaceuticals coming out of our North Campus at UNM, such as a new vaccine against HPV and a new vaccine against high cholesterol. If we correctly use an EB5 conference that deals with international trade and investment opportunities, letting Albuquerque act like a finance capital for the first time in its existence, we can keep the HPV vaccine here, lay the blueprint for the high cholesterol vaccine, and move an entire industry from our city, from the education spheres. With patents already in places of physical infrastructure that aren't moving away, we can use all of our economic tools in the toolbox to safely claw those back if anything were to fail. This is so important because this is the type of access we don't have in our communities. These are the things that we might not know and that we can literally build a future around. Things like making it easier for us to do trade internationally and with First Nations community around us through blockchain. Things like pairing that Beijing Arts District with our city and our culture. We can add a new flavor to a globalized international dialogue that has actually been disadvantageous to cities like Albuquerque, indigenous communities, and marginalized groups since day one. Albuquerque is worth so much more than this conversation has even reflected. And there is something in this race that is a tipping point and a hot iron for a future. And if we don't get there, if we continue to ask and answer the same questions that aren't even from us half the time and are from experts that we are now pretending like we're a magic wand for, and we're not, understand the whole umbrella of government and see exactly what America can do. If we don't get to talk about a future, all of us have already lost. Thank you for being here today.
Just a reminder that closing statement's not quite
Oh,
yet,
yeah, not a
but that's
closing
okay. That's
statement,
all
just
right. You can do it all over again.
Yeah.
It's all right.
Yeah, there's so much.
Mr. Keller, anything you want to add to what's been said tonight?
I think we didn't have time to get into some key issues that I think are really important. And one is jobs. And at the end of the day, I believe that we have been looking at economic development the wrong way for the last 20 years in Albuquerque. And we have a host of amazing tools that I've ran legislation on and studied at the auditor's office. But at the end of the day, all of these tools, tax increment districts, LEDA funding, JTIP funding, so much of them goes to companies that we want to recruit and move here from out of state. And I think that model, it's important that we keep trying it, but that should not be the basis for our economic development. It just hasn't worked at the end of the day. And who's left behind? If you are a company now, an entrepreneur, or a growing company that is making directed energy or photo optics, and you want to hire 10 more people, do you have access? Has the city ever reached out to you for any of those programs? No. That's what I want to switch. That's what I want to invert in our city. We should aim all our economic development activity to companies that are already here, to companies that have growth potential and that are providing a career path, not just an entry-level job. That is a huge shift in what we've been doing in terms of economic development, and I think that's a way that we can actually invest in our community that creates jobs that is so different than what we've been doing over the last 20 years. The other thing is education. And at the end of the day, we always say, well, the mayor doesn't have any direct role for education, or maybe we should hire someone to think about education. I think it's time we actually step up for our kids in a meaningful way. I think the city should take over and run at every school in our city comprehensive after-school programs and over the summer. That means math support, science support. It means different activities even for parents, whether it's dental services and healthcare, but it also means sports, and it also means coding camp. It's time the city actually say, we are going to do something meaningful for our kids where we can, and that is after school and over the summer. And the good news is we have pilot projects on all of these. It just takes a mayor to say, this is going to help us define who we are as a city, and it's going to help us define how we actually make things different for our kids, and we end that generational poverty and that generational addiction. This is our only window into those issues, and we've got to seize that moment. And I think the third thing is around energy and renewable energy. We should be an energy neutral city, and we're not that far away from doing it. I think we should have a zero electricity bill, and we can get there in about 4 years.
Mr. Colon.
So I too agree that we didn't get to talk enough about job creation, and I appreciate the state auditor's observations when it comes to creating and investing in local businesses, because that's what I've been doing on the ground. Having practiced law in this community for many years, 16 to be exact, I've represented individuals who've tried to do public-private partnerships in our community to create jobs for our community. Because what we know for sure is that when you invest in local entrepreneurs, whether it's good time or bad, they're sticking around. So it's a long-term investment. As opposed to trying to reach out and attract others to Albuquerque, let's invest in the people who've been here in the good times and the bad, before 2008 and after 2008. Let's make this a community we can believe in. Now, that means we've got to advocate. It means we've got to go up to Santa Fe, like I've done the last couple of years, to talk about making sure that we give a priority to our local businesses when it comes to obtaining goods and services with taxpayer dollars. There's absolutely no reason checks ought to be flying out of the city of Albuquerque to out-of-state firms. We need to keep our money in New Mexico with New Mexico businesses. And I've got a great plan out there at colonformayor.com as it relates to public safety, making sure that we create a safe city. Because I can't do the economy, I can't work on education until we make sure that people feel safe in their homes in Albuquerque. Because when job creators look at Albuquerque, they don't know whether they want to expand their business when we've got a crime issue like we have today. So for me, it's all about crime all the time, and making sure in those first 100 days, that's what we focus on. After that, the sky's the limit, because I believe in the potential of the city of Albuquerque. And this was supposed to be rebuttal, but I see we've all turned it into a closing statement for the closing statement. So I will close this closing statement to the closing statement at this time. Thank you.
That's great. I think I misunderstood the question. I thought that that the question was to add something on to perhaps segue off something others said, or add something on to what I said, and it was to be 1 minute. Did I misunderstand that?
No, you're right on it.
Okay.
What's happened is my phone's run out of power, my little beepy thing.
I
So my minute counter has gone
I
away at the most
see.
inopportune time, so.
I prepared to answer the actual question, although these have been riveting, and thank you very much. I have a whole bunch of things to say. Let's go back to the art, because that's one of my areas of long expertise. And one of the things that I never got to mention is that the art project, meaning not on the wall, but the train, will not be the economic development success that it has the potential to be if the city doesn't also concurrently upgrade its zoning zoning codes. And so we're working on that at the same time. They refer to it as the IDO, the Integrated Development Ordinance. So that's one thing. Another thing with respect to economic development, which I don't think was what we were talking about at all tonight, but we should have been, I too agree that concentrating our energies on our own local, not necessarily small, but businesses that are local is very, very important. And one of the best ways we can do that is by creating a portal for new businesses and businesses that are continuing to do all of their regulatory processes in one place. But then that also segues into the idea of completely recreating the website of the city of Albuquerque. Who's used it lately? Who's used it? How friendly is it? Anyone raising it? Do you think it's friendly? I don't. I think it's unbelievable. So that portal where people would create and maintain businesses would be in the city of Albuquerque. Everything else that's been discussed, I agree with it.
Well done. Please.
Well, I just want to just elaborate a few seconds more, since we don't have a timer, on small businesses. Sure. You know, we have over 50,000 small businesses in our community, and my idea is to grow those small businesses. If we can just grow just a quarter of them by one job, imagine what impact that would have on our community. It would be huge. And I think we tend not to be supportive of small businesses. We tend, you know, what I've seen over the years, because I actually did work for 5 different mayors, I watched them bring in big businesses through tax incentives, different ways to bring them in, and it never worked. They left. They would leave. But our small businesses remain faithful. They worked hard. Small business owners work very, very hard. They pay their employees before they pay themselves. We need to show them some respect in this community, and we need to support our small businesses. So I'm just going to wrap it up with that and say, you know, one other thing, until we get our crime problem under control, our small businesses aren't going to thrive. No business is going to thrive here. All of the business owners that I've talked to have to reinforce their buildings with bars, with security doors, with cameras. I mean, those purchases add up. And so until we take care of the crime problem, I think our small businesses are going to continue to have issues. So it's crime all the time, like Brian says, I think, until we get the crime issues under control. And I think the voters are going to have to decide who has the experience up here, who can take care of the crime problem, who's actually fought crime in our city.
There you go. Mr. Lewis.
Let's talk about our entrepreneurial ecosystem that's growing in Albuquerque. It's new, and you know, a few years ago we had just a couple accelerators for new businesses and incubators. Now we have around 30. And there's this growing ecosystem where job creators, talented people, thought leaders are convening, have what they need to be able to take ideas and turn them into businesses. I'll double down on that ecosystem. I believe some of the best companies are going to start and grow in Albuquerque in the next few years because of that, because the city becomes the platform and the catalyst. I've had the privilege to be able to fund ABQID and you know, creative startups and a lot of the accelerators and incubators that I think are going to have give our city and talented people some of the best potential to be able to start great companies. And then, you know, when we talk about LEDA funds and JTIP, the city of Albuquerque had the foresight, city council last year, to be able to, or a few years ago, put about $10 million into a closing fund, a leading fund. The great thing about it is that fund has been used specifically for 2 companies that are homegrown companies in this city that have had success here, and those funds help them to expand and create jobs and continue to grow. So I think that's the right way, you know, to put those funds and to be able to make the kind of investments. But any business, we got to make investments. We have to invest in our future. We have to be forward thinking with technology to get the kind of companies that also think that way, that are going to want to do business and in the city of Albuquerque.
Well done. Now we're at closing statements. By the way, I appreciate you all handling your time with that, with no timer. That actually was good quality responses. That was actually pretty good. However, for closing statements, I will have somebody in my ear telling me whether it's 1 minute, and you just hear me say 1 minute, so wrap up when you hear me say that. Now, you guys chose who would have the order of the closing statements, so we'll start with Gus.
The last words we just heard were invest in our future. And I want this closing statement to be more about questioning the philosophies that have allowed us to get this far in the governmental structure that currently disadvantages us as communities. The current dialogue is wrong. It's reflexive. Government positions aren't inherently like each other. That's obscene. That's how we get people running for school board, moving to county commission, and jumping all over this entire structure. This is how we get people tokenizing our communities and moving through us for positions and identities instead of ideas. What I did in that last rebuttal was I didn't talk about job growth. I explicitly told you things that maybe you haven't heard before, how we can get into those, open up those fields, and use diversified budget sources that aren't even currently in our economy. That's what just happened in that minute. It wasn't rhetoric. It was hard-lined. I will put an underline under that every single day. And if there's a 22-year-old from your community, from your public schools, just graduating from the University of New Mexico, that can stand toe-to-toe with this assumed political model, can answer these same questions, can put forward the cognitive effort and critical thinking, then maybe we all have to choose a different future for ourselves as a municipality. And that's why I run, because Albuquerque is ready to choose a different future for itself. And I'm so excited to get to be here on this journey with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Petrotti. Ms. Garcia-Holmes, you were second?
Well, I just want to say, I decided to run for mayor because I was born and raised here in Albuquerque. I love Albuquerque. I raised 5 children here. I didn't do it by myself. I did it with my husband, Earl, there in the front row. And, you know, my youngest daughter just graduated from UNM. I want to see Albuquerque the vibrant jewel that it used to be. We have weather here. We have culture here. We have delicious food here. And we have tremendous opportunities. We have things here in Albuquerque that no other place has. The mountains, the sunsets. I just can't believe that crime has taken advantage of us and we let this problem get out of hand. I have a vision for our downtown area to be separated into districts, but I want our city to flow. That way when visitors come here, they get off the freeway and it just flows into the different areas, Old Town, a music district. You know, many mayors have tried to build a downtown arena. And I think that's going to be key. Sometime in my administration, I am going to look to build a downtown arena because we need things for people to do here. We have MMA, boxing, we have an arena football team, and a downtown arena can service that community.
Very much appreciate that. Mr. Keller, closing statement in 1 minute.
You know, I think for me, this race is really about choices. And I bring a mix of things to the table. And I think a real important piece is that I'm the only candidate who's run a government agency. And I know that might sound old guard and stodgy, but this is a $1 billion city. And there are 5,000 employees that work for the city. And we have major problems. And so I think we need a mayor who's been around the block a few times and who knows how to deal with this, who's not afraid to make tough decisions, and who can combine 2 things, a vision for the future of our city and also a track record of actually getting things done. And for me, that vision is what our campaign is all about. Folks can visit our website if they've been to any of our events. We have a specific set of ideas, a shared vision for Albuquerque. And we update this every month as we learn and as we grow. But people aren't voting for me. They're voting for a vision. And I think that's really important because this race isn't about who's going to be mayor. It's about that next set of 12 steps that's actually going to make a difference in our city. And that's what I'm dedicated to.
Appreciate that. Mr. Lewis, 1 minute, closing statement.
The mayor of the city of Albuquerque is the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar corporation. And we need a mayor who has the kind of experience as a CEO, as somebody who's created private jobs in this city, who understands what helps job creators grow and the kinds of what government can do to hurt job creators. And we need leadership in the city. You know, the downfall of elected officials is when they begin to think that they're a little more important than they really are. And they forget that it's about listening to the people of this city. And we need somebody that'll put the people of the city before partisan politics. I've never held an elected partisan position. And 100% of what we do at City Hall should have absolutely nothing to do with partisan politics, but ensuring that the city is led well and good decisions are made on behalf of the city. As your mayor, I will ensure that this city is the worst place to be a criminal. As your mayor, I will ensure that this is the most unwelcome place for those that want to steal our cars and break into homes and wreak havoc on the city's neighborhoods. I believe it can change, and I'm rising to that challenge, and I want to ask for your help and to join me.
Appreciate that as well. Ms. Wheeler-Deichel, your turn. 1 minute.
Thank you, and thank you for this event tonight. This has been very, very exciting and really interesting. I am running for mayor because for the last 9 years, nearly 9 years, I have been down in the trenches with the people of Albuquerque, but also at the same time working with elected officials, with city staff on a huge arena of projects. And I propose to you that I am the only candidate among this panel that has really gotten down and dirty into the trenches doing projects for years and years. I come from the private sector, but I am a business and job creator, and I bring no political baggage with me. And I completely agree with Councilor Lewis that this job should not be partisan. Our city charter backs me up on that. But as I go around the city and I talk to people because I'm campaigning, I say, I'm running for mayor, and they say, when's the election? Who's running? How many candidates? They don't even know. And when I interview them a little bit more, most folks say that they've lost interest in politics because they're tired of the undue influence of money and also partisan divisions. Whether they're true or not, we have to portray ourselves as not being partisan and willing to work with the entire public. Everyone who resides within the boundaries of this city are those who we as mayor, I as mayor, will serve. I will commit to serving everyone.
Appreciate that. Mr. Colon, final statements.
Thank you, Gene. You know, when I was 19, I buried my 49-year-old father. He had muscular dystrophy, and from that day forward, I was an island unto myself. The community really filled the gap for me. And I think how you get there does matter. I think you have to understand the lives of people in this community that are struggling. And thankfully, because of community, I broke the cycle of poverty. And as I sit here today, my son is a very proud Albuquerque High Bulldog who's on a presidential scholarship studying biomedical engineering at the George Washington University. I want my son to come home when he graduates. But we've got to create a safe city and a smart city if he's going to think about doing that. I'm living the life of so many families in Albuquerque right now. Our children are going away with no intent of coming back. So for me, this is not just political, it's personal. We've got to put politics aside and bring the community together to lift up Albuquerque. I know we can push back on crime in Albuquerque because this community is laser-like focused on the issue. And when we focus together on an issue, we can do just about anything. So at the end of the day, for me, it's about crime and public safety, creating a safe city where my family's family can raise their children. It's about making sure that we focus on economic development and education. No more hall passes for the mayor, and no more crime in our streets of Albuquerque. My name is Brian Colon. I hope to be given the privilege of serving as mayor of our beautiful city of Albuquerque.
We want to thank everyone for joining us for the 2017 Albuquerque Mayoral Forum in partnership with the Criminal Law Division here at the State Bar Association. Thanks to my co-moderators, Martha Burke, of course, and Jeff Proctor. If you missed any of this event or want to rewatch it, or just head to newmexicoinfocus.org. You can find it there. You can also watch the responses from another candidate, that would be County Commissioner Wayne Johnson, who had missed tonight's forum because of a zoning meeting. And tune into NMPBS on September 4th when we rebroadcast this forum on our secondary channel, that's 9.1. Thanks for being here. Remember to go out and vote. Early voting starts when? September 16th. Thank you. Election day is when? October 6th. Right on. There you go. I'm Gene Grant from New Mexico in Focus and New Mexico PBS. Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for watching, and good night. I'm sweating like a pig now. Ay, 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 ay.